Go to hecmedia.org for the arts and authors,
Completely accidental because I never set out to write a book.
culture and community,
It's considered to be the oldest organic farm west of the Mississippi.
science,
I'm wearing 3D glasses. We're operating on a high-definition screen.
and history.
I was really blown away by the strategy that was used through the Underground Railroad.
Education,
I look forward to the day when they graduate high school. I want to be a part of that.
films,
It's a long cost penny.
Finding the coin places the site firmly in the 13th century.
what's happening now around St. Louis, and more.
This is powerful, seeing my mother's story being told.
Search all of HEC Media's award-winning content. HEC Media has earned the Mid-America Emmy Award for Overall Excellence 4 times. See for yourself at hecmedia.org.
Looking for videos to use in homeschool, classroom, or hybrid learning settings? Need them aligned to standards, lesson plans, or activity ideas? We've got them at educate.today.
A pioneering African-American military pilot, a group bonding over art, and a new book honoring a famous female poet. Sunday at 9:30 a.m.
HEC Media. Recognized, celebrated, honored time and again for excellence in the industry. HEC Media has been bringing home the hardware for over a decade. Arts and education to author talks, magazine shows and documentaries, individual craft achievements to overall excellence. Find all of the award-winning content at hecmedia.org.
A pioneering African-American military pilot, a group bonding over art, and a new book honoring a famous female poet. Sunday at 9:30 a.m.
How are you all tonight? I'm Kristen Sorth, and I'm the Director and CEO of the St. Louis County Library, and I'm so happy to welcome you tonight to hear Tony Messenger. Let's give him a round of applause. He's waiting in the back. Tonight's event is part of the Library Foundation's Westfall Politics and History series. We are very pleased to have our partners at HEC Media with us tonight. As you can see, that's who gave me the cue. If you're not familiar with HEC, they are a nonprofit art and culture production company here in St. Louis. We have had such a huge response to this event, and HEC has very generously offered to live stream the presentation to people watching from home, which is great because we typically have the weirdest weather in St. Louis, and tonight is a great example of that. So we know that there are a lot of people watching from home tonight. I also want to recognize HEC's tremendous support throughout the pandemic, and I want to acknowledge that Dennis Riggs is here from HEC. Can you stand up and wave? Thank you, Dennis. So when the pandemic started in early March, we realized that we were going to have to cancel over 50 in-person author events planned for the year, and HEC saved the day by partnering with us on a virtual author series, allowing us to continue connecting our readers with our country's top writers. We have now partnered on over 170 virtual author events, and if you haven't tuned in, please do. They are just amazing. They're set up, Dennis and I were talking, they're set up more in terms of like a documentary style. They're just fantastic. So if you haven't tuned in, I encourage you to do that. And we've definitely learned post-COVID that we want to do some sort of in-person and virtual at the same time, because we know a lot of people are watching our author events that way that wouldn't come to the library. You can check all of them out at hecmedia.org or on the library or HEC Facebook or YouTube channels. I also want to thank our amazing bookseller, Left Bank Books. Let's give them a round of applause. They're, of course, St. Louis's premier independent bookstore. The team from Left Bank has copies of Tony's book for sale in the back of the room. And following the presentation, Tony will sign copies of the book in the north lobby. We are going to try to socially distance the signing as much as possible, so please be patient with us as we get that going. And for COVID safety reasons, there will not be a photo opportunity. And then Left Bank Books has pre-signed copies of the book if you prefer not to wait in the signing line. Okay, on to tonight's presentation. Our guest this evening, Tony Messenger, is the Pulitzer Prize-winning Metro columnist for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Tony was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in Commentary in 2019 for his series of columns on Missouri debtor prisons. His new book, Profit and Punishment: How America Criminalizes the Poor in the Name of Justice, continues his call for state justice system reform for millions of poor Americans trapped in a cycle of indebtedness as a result of fines and court costs from petty crimes. Senator Claire McCaskill described Tony's work on this subject as a must-read for a nation seeking a bipartisan path forward on criminal justice reform. In addition to his 2019 Pulitzer Prize, Tony was also nominated in 2015 for his series of editorials on the protests in Ferguson. For this series, he was also awarded the Sigma Delta Chi Award for Best Editorials given by the Society of Professional Journalists. In 2018, Tony was awarded a Missouri Honor Medal, the highest award bestowed by the University of Missouri School of Journalism. I am very proud to be hosting this event at St. Louis County Library, and I'm also honored to call Tony a friend. Our friendship developed, can you guess, over books. So we started visiting when I first became the director of the library, and we talked about Jack Danforth's book, and it grew to our mutual appreciation of Colin Gordon's book, Mapping Decline. If you haven't read that book, I encourage you to read it. It is definitely a commentary on cities and particularly St. Louis, and of course our love of craft beer. So Tony and I also happen to love a good beer and soul taco. So those are the things that we have in common. And it has really, our conversations have really evolved into our wish for criminal justice reform. So I'm so happy to get to talk to him tonight, and I hope everyone grabs a copy of the book because it's just amazing. So it's my great privilege to sit down with Tony, and let's give him a big welcome as he comes up to the stage. Hi.
How you doing?
Good, how are you? We had to do like the COVID shuffle as we walked.
That's right.
I went behind and you went in.
We were socially distant.
That's right. So I told Tony, I read his book and I have all kinds of highlighted passages in here. And I texted him the other day and I told who has the book? Who's read the book? Have any of you read it? If you have, okay. So I texted Tony and I told him that his book gave me fight or flight. And let me tell you why. So I looked up the definition of fight or flight, and there are three reactions that you get. So it's alarm, exhaustion, and alarm, resistance, and exhaustion. And so that is how I felt kind of over and over again in this book, but I flipped it around. I think alarm was first, and then exhaustion, and then resistance. Because if you read this book, you will want to resist all of the things that you hear about in this book. So that's my setup. So I know lots of you read Tony's column. Who reads Tony's column? All of us. It's amazing, right? So I told him I was going to ask this question because I have this question all the time, and I hear it from people. Can you talk about how you come up with ideas for your column, how these columns came about, and then just the transition from column to book and how hard that was?
So a lot of my column ideas come from people like you. I meet people in the community and somebody says, hey, I read your column about, XYZ. I've got a brother or a sister or mom or dad who had that similar situation. Can I talk to you about it? And those are my favorite sorts of columns because they become so organic and tied to the community. And people email me and they Facebook message me, and that's how I get a lot of the columns. The Facebook message has an interesting story as it relates to this book. So when I started writing columns on debtors' prison in Missouri, the first one I wrote was on a woman named Victoria Branson in St. Francis County, and then other people started telling me about this problem. And Michael Barrett, who was the head of the public defender system, told me, you're missing something. There's a big part of the story here about how people are being charged bills for jail time and then put back in jail because they can't afford to pay their bills. And there's lots of cases like this, and I want to help you get to the bottom of those. And so Michael and some other people that I know in the legal community, I asked them all by email, hey, send me some of the most egregious cases that you can think of. And one of the cases that they sent me was Brooke Bergen's case. And when I looked at her court documents, I thought, in my mind, this is a math story. Because Brooke Bergen, who lived in Dent County, stole an $8 tube of mascara from Walmart and ended up, through a series of circumstances related to the criminalization of her poverty, spending a year in jail. Not because she committed other offenses, but because the private probation company that was supervising her kept saying that she was missing meetings and failing drug tests, and they kept sending her back to the judge, and the judge kept putting her in jail. So then she does a year in jail for stealing an $8 tube of mascara, which seems egregious enough, but she got a $15,000 bill for her jail time. And the judge would then call her back over and over again to get money from that jail bill or threaten her with more jail time. And I thought, What an easy story for people to understand. Does it seem reasonable to do a year in jail and get a $15,000 bill for stealing an $8 tube of mascara and be tethered to the court system for a very long time? So I wrote that column. I wrote about Brooke's case and 2 or 3 other people in the same column. And I didn't talk to Brooke before that column. I had called the number that I had on the various court documents, and like many poor people, it was no longer the number that she had. She had already moved, and you know that happens when you go to jail. You lose your apartment, and you lose your phone, and you lose your job, and you got to move on and restart your life. And so the day after that column ran, I got a Facebook message from Brooke Bergen. And it was a low, low point for me as a journalist. Every young journalist is taught these days to search for people on Facebook and on Twitter and TikTok and Instagram and the 3 forms of social media that the teenagers in this crowd are already using that none of us have actually heard of yet. And I didn't do it. I didn't do it because I thought I knew the story. The story was a math story. And this woman that I just wrote about in the paper sends me a Facebook message the next day, and I felt so stupid. But she was gracious. She's like, thank you for writing about me. We didn't think anybody cared about what we're dealing with in this county where they keep putting us in jail because we're poor. It really has devastating effects on my life. I'd like to tell you about my life. And Brooke changed the course of my reporting in the newspaper in those columns because I went to Dent County to get to meet Brooke, and Brooke introduced me to LaShawn Casey, and LaShawn Casey introduced me to Amy Murr, and Amy Murr introduced me to Janice Bodie, and I met all of these young, strong, courageous women who had made some mistakes, fought drug addiction, dealt with difficult lives and poverty, and I recognized that I had the story wrong. The story is about the people who live among us in poverty, and we're allowing our government through the court system to be used as a backdoor tax to violate people's civil rights. We've changed what our court system is supposed to be about, and we're using it for wealth extraction, and it has devastating effects on people's lives. So that simple Facebook message really changed the course of my reporting, and it was really the key to how I went about writing Profit and Punishment, in that I decided to focus on 3 single mothers from around the country. Brooke is one of them, Kendi Kilman from Oklahoma is another one, and Sasha Darby from Columbia, South Carolina. Because I think if we're actually going to get people to care about the damage that's being done to poor people in the name of justice, as I write in the title, we have to understand who these people are and what their challenges are and how the court system is being used to abuse them. And so a simple Facebook message to me sometimes actually does get my attention. Really helped lead to a book. The second part of your question, I told Kristen, you're only going to have to ask me one question, and then I'll talk for 3 hours. The second part of your question is about that transition between columns and book writing. And I have to tell you, I was texting with my editor last night. Pranoy Sarkar is his name. He was with St. Martin's. He's now with Little Brown. And he really helped me. We were texting last night about the moment in the writing when both of us became frustrated with each other. Because I write columns for a living, and columns are finite things, and they're 700 to 900 words approximately, and they generally have sort of a beginning and a middle and an end, and they're done, and then I go on to the next column the next day. And book writing is so completely different, and the deadline is so completely different. And early on, I was thinking about chapters as columns. They were just long columns. They were 6,000 words or so. And chapters are not columns. They're different. And the concept of trying to help readers carry a narrative from the beginning of a book to an end of a book, where you're giving them the information they need and yet continuing to have more morsels to give them later on as they have enough information to be able to build on that. That was a difficult process, and I can tell you in my first draft, I was not very good at that process. Pernod told me one time, as an author, you're a very good columnist. He was joking, but we were texting last night about the frustration we had with each other because of the way he edits. He didn't just, red mark me and send it back and say, fix this, fix this, fix this. He would ask me questions and eventually get me to the point where I realized this isn't working and I have to figure out why. I have to figure out how to reconfigure my narrative. And as a writer, that was a big challenge. I think I accomplished it. People who have read the book and will read the book, eventually you'll be the judges of that. But it was a tremendous challenge. One of the things I did while I was writing the book was I forced myself to read more. As you know, because we've talked about it, I like to read books, but I don't read as often as I'd like to. But when I started writing the book, I would get in this practice of buying a nonfiction book and a fiction book together that I wanted to read to challenge myself to see different styles of writing and how I could apply them in my own book.
How did you, just as a follow-up, did you take the fiction method or the non-fiction method, or did you kind of merge them together when you wrote? Because there are parts of this that it almost feels like it should be fiction. It's so crazy. I mean,
I was at Skylark Books in Columbia last night, and Judge Gary Oxenhandler was sitting in your chair asking me questions. And before we started, he said, I want the people in the audience to know that this is a nonfiction book, but you don't think it's a nonfiction book as you're reading
Exactly.
it. And I that was how I started texting with my editor that night after that event, because that's what we were going for. That was sort of, I didn't want, a lot of the books in the criminal justice realm, with all due respect to them, because they very much informed my reporting and were very helpful, are written by law professors, and sometimes they feel like they're written for other law professors. Law professors aren't going to change this problem. Citizens are going to change this problem by recognizing that their neighbors should not be treated differently in the courts than they are, just because they might have the ability to write a check to avoid any sort of repercussions in the criminal justice system.
Can you talk a little bit about poverty and how that just plays such a role in what's happening to these individuals? Because there are circumstances, the story that stands out the most to me is a person who needs to go see her grandma because she's sick, and she buys a car from her ex-husband for $500, and then she gets pulled over, and then the cycle just starts. She was doing okay, and a lot of the people in Tony's books are doing pretty okay. I mean, they're doing okay, and then this one thing leads to one thing after another.
The reality of poverty, as I understand it in my own life, and as I understand it from the people that I report about, not just in this book, but fairly regularly in my columns, is exactly what you're talking about. That first of all, it's relative. Some people are doing okay, even though they're in a fairly deep state of poverty. But one little thing can change your life so significantly. The story you're talking about is Kendi Kilman, who in the first chapter buys her ex-husband's car because she's got a sick grandmother to go visit in Arkansas from Oklahoma, and she has a vehicle, but it's really just to get to the grocery store. It wasn't going to make it over the highway, and that decision leads to an incident with criminal justice repercussions that helps carry the narrative of the book. And Kendi's really interesting in that during COVID, during a time when I was doing some reporting on the book, I took a trip to Oklahoma and had a dinner at Kendi's apartment with a bunch of her family. She lives in, it's not Section 8 housing, but it's a apartment complex that does have a lot of subsidized apartments, including the one she lives in, and a lot of her family members live in that same complex. And they all got together and we had dinner together, And she asked a question. She's got grown children, and she asked a question. There were 3 generations of the Kilman family there, and she's like, what, when you were kids, because her kids are all kind of like mine, spread out in age, and she's like, when you were little, what was your memory of what meals were like when things were tough? And they all had a different answer about whether or not it was Hamburger Helper or ramen noodles. It just changed the meal that this is what we're going to eat until the disability check comes in next Friday was different based on, the times of their lives. But they weren't embarrassed by it. They weren't shamed by it. It was just a part of this is their life. This is where they are in their sense of poverty. And they know they're poor, but they don't really think about it or talk about it that much until you get pulled into the criminal justice system and the court wants $1,000 and is threatening you with jail if you don't come up with that $1,000.
And that leads right into a question about the fees, like how the fees that are charged for individuals who are going through this process, it's just one fee after another, and it is a fee that has nothing to do with their initial crime in many cases, and then it's a fee to be in jail, and that they're often given the option of go to jail or pay a fee that you can't, and they choose jail, and then that just leads to more debt. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So I want 2 examples from the book that talk about how different courts deal with this differently. So Sasha Darby in South Carolina ends up with about $1,000 worth of court debt related to a misdemeanor that she had pleaded guilty to. And at some point, she's got it down to about $700 or so, and she gets picked up by a police officer because there's a warrant out for her arrest because she's fallen behind in her payment. She missed a payment. They issued a bench warrant, and she gets arrested and taken to jail. Well, in South Carolina, in Mississippi, in a couple of other states in the South, what they do, and you talk about literal debtors' prisons. The judges won't say that these are debtors' prisons, but that's exactly what they are. You show up and you owe the $700 or $800, and the judge says, "Can you pay?" And Sasha says, "No, I can't." And so the judge says, "Well, here's what we're going to do. You're going to go to jail today, and I'm going to take off about $50 a day of what you owe, and you'll be in my jail until your debt is gone, and then you'll be done." Sasha doesn't have a choice, doesn't have an attorney, not even a public defender. She waived that because she didn't realize what she was doing her first day in court. So Sasha goes to jail and does about 20 days to pay off her debt. And it's just such a horrendous example of how poor people have a completely different repercussion in the criminal justice system. She hadn't committed another crime. She had pleaded guilty to her time. She had to pay all these fines and fees. And I'll get into some of the details about the fines and fees here in a moment. But the bottom line is she owed the court debt and couldn't pay it. And so she went to jail and ended up, again, I'm not going to give away all of the narrative in the book, but she ended up with some pretty devastating consequences. So compare that to the case of William Everts, who isn't one of my main characters in the book, but it's a shorter story that I tell earlier in the book. He was a person who many, many years ago in Caldwell County in northwest Missouri had stolen a computer from a church. And the police tracked it to him, asked if they could search his trunk. Sure enough, the computer's in the church. They open up the trunk, and I'll never forget this because it's on the police report. He's like, "I'm so stupid. Who steals a computer from a church?" So they get the computer back, they take it back to the church, but they also arrest Mr. Everts. He's poor, and they take him to jail. And he can't afford to pay the cash bail, so he's in jail for several days before he eventually just pleads guilty so he can get out of jail, and then they give him a bill for jail time. Well, by the time I'm writing about him, he's a homeless person in Kansas City. And he's now a burden on the taxpayers in Kansas City. But what happens is he ends up getting picked up by police for, some sort of vagrancy violation on the streets of Kansas City. They find out that he's got a warrant out for his arrest. He always has a warrant out for his arrest because he can't afford to pay his Caldwell County bill. And every month he doesn't pay, the judge issues a warrant for his arrest. And so after this cycle of 2 or 3 years of this homeless person being taken from Kansas City back to Caldwell County, spend some more time in jail, get a bigger bill, go back to being homeless in Kansas City, back and forth, this woman who serves for a social service agency, who's a volunteer, takes him under his wing, gets him cleaned up, tries to help him get a job, get educated, and all of these sorts of things to help. And he tells her about this court debt problem and how it's making it harder for him to get a fresh start. So she writes a letter to the judge, and she asks the judge if he'll do for Mr. Everts similar to what the judge did for Sasha Darby. Now keep in mind, what the judge did for Sasha Darby was absolutely wrong. It was horrendous. But that's what Mr. Everts was willing to do to somehow get out from under this debt that was contributing to his homelessness. So she writes the letter to the judge and says, are you willing to forgive this debt? He'll come, spend time in jail. You decide how much time in jail. At least he won't be on the streets for a period of time. And then when he gets out, he won't owe you any debt. And those of us who are trying to provide him services will help guide him on to his life. Judge said no. I can't put somebody in my jail for free. He owes the money. And Mr. Everts remained homeless. So different courts obviously deal with it. Neither one of those situations is just, but both of them are fairly standard. What really got me started on this was this idea that in Missouri, most rural counties charge for jail time. And I just found that really offensive, and I was shocked by it. And even when I started to talk to people in the legal community, because it doesn't happen here in St. Louis, people I talked to in the legal community were shocked that this goes on too. Some of them knew about it, but didn't really know how extensive the problem was. But charging for jail time is really just part of the problem. Every state has gone through a period of time where their legislature, and it's worse in states that have legislatures where they have the fairly recent, in the last couple of decades, Republican ethic that says no new taxes, really particularly since the recession in 2008. Those state legislatures still need to come up with money for their constituents for various things, but if they're not going to pass taxes, they have to come up with revenue other places. So they've turned to the courts. And there will be a $3 fee for this and a $10 fee for that and an $8 fee for that. And before you know it, you get out of court, whether it's for a traffic ticket or a minor misdemeanor, and you owe $1,000. And the key is that's not restitution in most cases. That's not a fee that the legislature established to try to be a deterrent so that you didn't recommit another crime. Most of it is fees that the legislature established, or in some cases the local county commission or the local city council established, in order to raise money for some other government service that has almost nothing to do with the dispensation of justice in that particular jurisdiction. And that's why these fees are so high in every state in the country. And it's, that's one of the things that I write about in the book, is how the different states do it. Not every state is as bad as another state. Missouri's pretty bad. Oklahoma's pretty bad. South Carolina's pretty bad. Those are the three states that I focus on for the narrative. But every state has this problem, and it has to get fixed in the legislative arena primarily. But judges can also play a role. One of the problems that I see in the criminal justice system is that too many judges aren't standing up for the defendants' civil rights who are coming before them and recognizing I can waive those fines and fees. I do not have to allow myself to be used as a tax collector to threaten you with jail time in order to collect fines and fees that are going to go pay for, you know, some wish list of the local presiding commissioner or the local sheriff or the prosecutor. A lot of judges can fix that problem right now without a legislature having to do anything.
That Tony and I talked a little bit before about the judges in this book. So when you start reading this book, there are some judges that you will come to not like very much, I would say, in the book. And so there's 3 of them that I have questions about, so many questions about. But you know, some of the judges started to get very frustrated with Tony's columns. And there's a story in the book that I don't want to give too much away, and Tony can give it away if he wants to, but a bailiff basically came and talked to you, like tried to keep you from going in to hear the court proceedings.
Yeah, some of you are familiar with this story because I wrote a version of it in a column in the Post-Dispatch. It was a day that I went to go to see Brooke Bergen in court. And I stood in line with about 30 or 40, I mean, it was a lot of people to get into court that day, and most of them were there because they owed money. This was a judge, Judge Brandy Baird, who used to have these payment review dockets where everybody coming to court on that particular day was just there because they owed money. And I showed up, and I start to walk through the metal detector, and I put my notebook and my pen and my keys over in the, you know, the little basket, and the bailiff says, what's your name? And I said, I'm not on your list. He had a list of all the people that had cases that day. And he's like, well, why are you here? I said, I'm a reporter. I'm just coming to observe court today. Well, I don't know if you can do that. I said, yes, I can. This is public court. I don't even have to be a reporter. I could just be, you know, Joe off the street, but I'm going to come observe court today. Well, you need to wait right here, Sonny. And so the bailiff went back, and I just stood there, and I briefly thought for a moment, this is the day I get arrested. This judge isn't, I had already written about this judge. I knew she wasn't going to be very happy with me. But the bailiff goes back and talks to the judge for a little bit, and then comes back to me and says, you didn't follow the Supreme Court rules. You can't come into court today. And I knew what he was talking about. There's a Supreme Court rule in Missouri where if a reporter wants to take pictures in the courtroom, you have to get permission. You have to go through a court coordinator who then makes a request to the judge, and the judge can say yes or no. But I didn't have a camera. I left my phone in the car. I was not taking pictures. I had a notebook and a pen. And I told the bailiff, I said, the judge is wrong. I didn't violate any rule. There's no rule that says anybody can't come in and observe court. I'm coming in to observe court today. And if the judge stops me, I'm going to need some time to call an attorney so that we can file a writ with the Supreme Court to force the judge to let me come into court today. And that didn't make the bailiff very happy. And he went back and he talked to the judge again. And he came back and he had this angry look on his face, and he just pointed at me, and I followed him, and he pointed to a space in the courtroom and said, you can sit over there. And I did watch court that day. And I saw a whole group of Missouri citizens who were just there because they were poor. One guy tapped me on the shoulder and whispers in my ear, my mom lives in St. Louis. She reads your columns. I want you to know there's lots of us down here. It's not just the couple of people you're writing about. And then he walked past me, and he went up to that, you know, the bar that separates the government officials from the rest of us who were there in court. And there's a chair for the prosecutor, and there's a chair for the public defender, and there's a chair for a woman named Lisa Blackwell, who owned the private for-profit probation company that supervised all of these people who were either on pretrial release or, if they had pleaded guilty, on probation. She's not an elected official. She's a private business person who has a contract with the court, and she's standing up there next to the prosecutor. And this gentleman walks by me and gives her some crumbled up cash, and so that he doesn't have to go to jail that day. And she basically had the power of the judge. They'd bring up a case. Brooke Bergen had a case that day. They'd bring the case up. Lisa Blackwell would, thumbs up, thumbs down. They paid money. They didn't pay money. Well, they missed a hearing this week or whatever. And the judge would decide whether or not somebody went to jail. That's probably our tornado.
Can you tell us what your phones say?
Tornado warning in this area until 8:15 Central Standard Time. Take shelter now in a basement or an interior room on the lowest floor of a sturdy building. This is a sturdy building.
Yes, it's so sturdy you can't get cell service in the basement. So,
So what shall we do?
Carrie, keep going. Keep going.
Okay.
Okay, Dan says to keep going.
We're going to keep going, and I understand if anybody feels like they need to get out of here, do what you need to do. Left Bank Books is going to have plenty of books for you, and if we have to make other arrangements for me to do some signatures at some other time because of the weather, we'll make sure that happens. So if you end up needing a signed book and can't get one today because of this weather stuff, make sure you talk to Left Bank Books. They'll be in touch with me, and we'll make sure it happens in some capacity. So go ahead.
Okay.
Where were we? Next question.
Okay, so that brings up the question of, and they're monitoring the weather. So if we need to go to the basement, we will, I promise. Talk about the private probation companies, because I don't think I had an understanding about that at all, and that plays such an important role in this book.
Not every state has private for-profit probation companies. Missouri does. Many states do, particularly in the South and in the Midwest. And what happened in Missouri is around the time of the last Great Recession, the state legislature decided we don't have enough money to pay for probation officers for people who are charged with misdemeanors. So we're just not going to do that anymore, and the counties can figure out what to do. So what the counties did was a bunch of former probation officers went out and started these private probation companies. Some companies were started by existing companies that bail bondsmen and that sort of thing. And they would sign these contracts with judges and with counties to say, we'll supervise all of your misdemeanor folks. And we'll charge a monthly fee, and we'll charge a fee for drug testing, and we'll charge for missed appointments, and we'll charge for ankle bracelets, $300 a month, and we'll charge for defensive driving classes, and it is a lot of money, and it's paid for by the people in the courts, most of whom are poor. And those private companies are the ones that often decide who goes back to jail more than anything else. Brooke Bergen fought drug addiction for most of her adult life. She wasn't arrested in this case. She did have some drug offenses on her record. She was not arrested in this case for a drug offense. She was arrested for shoplifting. But the judge required the private probation company to drug test her. Well, she was going to fail, and she did fail, and she ended up back in jail. Corey Booth, 17-year-old kid who stole a lawnmower in Caldwell County, and did some jail time for it, smoked pot, and he violated his probation because he couldn't pass a drug test and ended up going to jail long after he had stolen the lawnmower. When I first met Corey and started talking about him, it had been 10 years since his case had been adjudicated. He had not committed any further crimes, but the judge was still requiring him to come to court once a month to either pay some money or answer why he couldn't. And he didn't have the money. And his bill got higher every single year because at least once he would pee dirty, he would miss a call, he would not go to a court date, and then he'd end up in jail because there would be a warrant out for his arrest. By the way, these jurisdictions that issue a warrant for your arrest, they charge you for that too. And that's one of the real tragedies of this system. When I first started writing about folks in the criminal justice system, I would often get readers who would email me and say, well, if you can't do the crime, don't do the, or if you can't do the time, don't do the crime. You know, very much, you know, kind of a not an uncommon ethic, and a tough on crime ethic. And the reality, though, of the fines and fees situation in this country is that many jurisdictions spend more money trying to collect fines and fees than they actually bring in, because they're trying to collect from poor people who don't have any money. But every time they try to collect this money, they're issuing warrants, they're sending law enforcement people out, and they're going and they're having to arrest these people and put them in jail, and it costs a lot of money. It's not a good system if your goal is to increase public safety.
Okay.
I'm getting the sign that
Yes.
we have to make some movement.
Do you-
There's a storm coming through. It's in St. Charles right now.
okay.
And it's coming this way. So we may want to just get people out here so they can go home where that's safe.
We got to do what we got to do.
Yeah. Okay, so the storm is in St. Charles, and so we're thinking it's about quarter till, almost quarter till, so we're ending about 15 minutes earlier than we thought. If you want to stay and
If you don't want to drive all the way home, if it's going to take you a while, you're welcome to stay here. The building is safe down below. We can go downstairs too. So, but I think right now the storm's pretty far away.
So we've got some time. Do you want Tony do you want him to sign? Okay.
Okay.
Sorry. So Tony can still sign books if you all are okay with that. He'll be, if you're okay with that
Yeah.
too.
I'm going to stay and do whatever. So.
Okay. Okay, everyone, thanks for coming. Sorry about the weather. Let's give Tony a round of applause.
Thank you. I know. I know that. Crazy.